We're taking a look at the Vevor 6-inch electric post hole digger, or post hole auger, I should say. This is a promotional product. I appreciate them sending it to me. It's about 130 bucks on Amazon, and figured why not. I've reviewed a lot of things, so I try to find stuff that I may personally have a use for. This is actually based on, I think, a company called Extreme Power. 12 years ago, I found a 12-year-old video on YouTube about this style of electric auger. You can kind of tell by the gearbox. They've changed this gearbox. They had like some horizontal lines. Anyway, it's made by the same company, and surprisingly enough, they've been making them for more than a decade now as the alternative to gas post hole diggers. Vevor has a variety of gas ones, and I recommend you buy the more powerful one, like the 63cc. A lot of people do go for the gas just because of the nature of digging post holes. You're not going to be around electric power. And when you are, you do need to use like long extension cords, 50 and 100 foot. This does, they're calling this the JH300. They're advertising 1500 watts, which is like a 12.5 amp motor at 120 volts. Pretty stout. And these things are surprisingly common. There's a lot of cordless ones. Ryobi, Milwaukee, a variety of brands have these. Even Harbor Freight has a post hole digger. But a lot of them have the two kind of upper winged handles. And the reason I actually kind of liked this one is they've tried a different design where you have one handle for the trigger. This is more modernized. The one thing about gas ones is you don't have a reverse. And actually early electric ones didn't either, but this one does. That's what this is. This is not a speed setting. This is a reverse switch here. So I appreciate that it's been modernized. The reverse switch is easy to access on this handle. So if it does get jammed, these do have a clutch. This is advertised at 100 newton meters, about 75 foot-pounds. Sometimes that's a little bit weak. I think there's a hard time balancing the strength of the clutch, protecting the tool, and actually getting it to do effective work. And this is probably something where I'm going to go in and actually tighten up that clutch. And it's just on a set of gears with a... The reason this gearbox is so big is it's a quadruple reduction gearbox. There's actually the motor, and then there's an idler gear, and the power goes from the motor to one gear, another gear, a third idler gear, and then through the output shaft. So there's a ton of gears, and on one of those gear stacks there's a bronze bushing based clutch system. Just a gear with that sandwich between some washers, and then a nut that presses down on them to give you that clutch action. And so it's actually pretty easy to either adjust or to re-tighten if it ever gets loose. I did want to mention on this, they do actually have a real shaft seal. It's also a 20 millimeter, and it appears that there's unfortunately been a lack of effort for standardization, because with these post hole diggers there is 19 millimeter, there's 20 millimeter, and there's 22 millimeter. This is a 20 millimeter version, so you have to make sure that if you buy accessories. The accessories are actually pretty cheap on Amazon. A variety of companies sell them. You just have to, once again, make sure you get the right size post for it. So this does have a ton of grease in the gearbox, although since it has that shaft seal, I'm thinking of actually just adding a bunch of oil, filling it up quite a bit with oil. It'll help make the gears last a little bit longer and quiet it down. So for also the gas ones usually come with more of these augers. Now, as far as buying the gas one, I think comes with this 6-inch and maybe an 8-inch or a 4-inch or something like that. But there are a variety of different augers that can be ordered from. I think 3 or 4 inches is the smallest, but I've seen YouTube videos of these going all the way up to 12 inches. And these machines have a hard time trying to drive a 300 millimeter or 12-inch earth auger unless you have pretty soft ground. Now, the other reason for the clutch is, oftentimes you're hitting rocks and roots and stuff, and the augers just stop cold turkey. It's kind of funny to see people how they're battling with these things, which, after my long digression, gets me back to why I like this version, because I think people aren't interpreting it correctly. since you're running it in clockwise, the bit goes this way, which means the counter rotative force in the machine goes this way. So the idea is that you actually take the handle and brace it against your leg or your body, rather than trying to actually totally control it with just your arms. And then people complain where it does get caught and then they get smacked with the handle, and they're missing the point where you're not trying to fight the handle, you're pressing that against your body, so it's against a high mass portion of you, and then you can just focus on having a good footing. It does, seem to run pretty well. Whoop. This is an interesting aspect. The switch is lighted, so I guess that allows you to verify it has power, and so turn it on. It has a pretty serious motor in there, that's for sure. I guess the last thing to mention is, at least they tried here. We can see that there are no motor vents on the right-hand side or behind it. They're on the left-hand side and in front, just so it blows a little bit less dust at you, which I think is fine and still moves plenty of air. And yeah, I've seen these in red, the Vevor orange, black, green, and they all kind of recognize them with this weird mushroom cap. Since it's being laid down on the ground, people are kicking around dirt, I actually don't mind this design, because this is a cap and it pulls air just through the gap around the edge. But I think part of the reason they do it is these things get left on the side of buildings and stuff like that a lot. And over the more than a decade they've been making them, they've probably found that, or excuse me, earlier on, because I think they've always had this design, these are not water resistant at all, being an electric tool, but we're still recognizing that they may get leaned up somewhere, as this just helps prevent so much water from getting into the motor, and you may not actually ruin it if it does get left out in the rain occasionally. And it is fairly heavy. I mean, part of it's all the huge amount of large gears, but they also put a massive amount of grease in there to attempt to keep the gears from, or to allow them to at least have a longer lifespan, because it is a lot of force. And this twists 140 RPM, so it's pretty slow. The gas ones run about twice the speed, about 350. At least Vevor gives you like another 12-inch extension here, so you can dig post holes pretty deep. The 6 inches is probably about the right size. It's a good size for sinking 4x4 fence posts and that type of stuff, but not so large that's going to be a real struggle for the machine. Here's a quick look at the motor. Nothing too exciting. They don't do a lot of wrapping. There's like maybe a little bit of epoxy at the, I can't get the camera to really focus, to kind of secure the wires. It's folded contacts. This Bakelite brush holders, so it's a powerful motor. I wouldn't say the top end is the most impressive. I would have liked to have seen brush guides, maybe welded contacts on the commutator. But given the nature of the machine and the price, it's as expected, I guess you would say. So admittedly, the top of the motor isn't getting banged around too much on this, but it is an outdoor piece of equipment, and didn't really like these little screws with just a few threads holding in. And in many situations, like this, the plastic supports, bosses, that receive the screws are often made significantly deeper and drilled deeper than the fastener sizes they use. It's one of the confusions, a long time ago when I started taking apart particularly plastic tools, or even metal ones, is why they make the holes so much deeper than many of the fasteners. Sometimes, like in this case, this is the difference. There is a huge amount of extra space, so I had these socket head cap screws, put some little washers on, so I always kind of like doing these little upgrades. I do always double check certain situations, like this little power box on the side of the motor. You there rarely is extra space because it's so limited in the first place. But like gearbox screws and housing screws, I always double check. I have like a thin piece of wire that I stick down there and just hold my finger against and say, wow, you know, the hole goes a lot deeper than the fasteners, and that's how I'm able to determine the size and not risk bottoming out. Sometimes I still make a mistake, and like that Ryobi jigsaw that I made a video about the other day. But to make sure you don't bottom out and you actually get things, you know, it's a proper upgrade rather than risking stripping out the plastic. And in case you're wondering, yeah, all the extra surface area and the nice tight fit, even though these are fine thread screws in plastic, they'll end up holding better than, you know, 3 or 4 coarse threads on those short little screws. We'll take a look inside the gearbox, and I will make a quick note. Since this is quadruple reduction, there is gear shafts and spindle shafts on each of the 4 corners. They're all held in by ball bearings, which is like it's not a press fit, but they're extremely tight fit, and these gearboxes can be difficult not only to get apart, but they can be particularly difficult to get back together, because you really have to be patient and rock it back and forth until it seats all the way down. If you don't, you'll end up with a bearing that's cockeyed in there. Although this unit does, I mean, it has 10 rubber sealed ball bearings in it. And before I forget, they did put in a paper gasket here, which really complicates prying, because it'll just gouge out the gasket. So you gotta just basically stand on it and work the motor off. I do want to point out, so here's our gearbox. Oftentimes, now the reason I talk about this is Milwaukee power tools in particular. There's many power tools, but specifically Milwaukee also uses lots of ball bearings rather than needle bearings, which they could have totally used in here. Also, oddly, they're all rubber sealed. They may have determined that particles from the gears will cause the bearings to wear out quicker than the gears themselves, and after enough warranty returns, they said, we're just going to put in all rubber sealed ball bearings. So it's tough to get them out. If the machine is hot, you're probably not getting it apart, and oftentimes something like this will happen where the bearing will come halfway out of its seat and then the rest of it will come off the post, or it'll be halfway off the post. So when you do this, I always just like to take a real light screwdriver and just with a slotted screwdriver, just some light taps just to make sure that those bearings are all seated in. Take a close look at the shafts to make sure they're all properly pushed back in. It'll make reassembly easier. But this is the big clutch, and surprisingly enough, this is on the 3rd, not the 4th stage. Excuse me, the 2nd reduction. So what we have here is, this is the gear that the motor drives, has teeth that engage with the clutch, and then it has its teeth engage with the 3rd idler gear, and then way down in there you can just see the final drive. So oddly enough, the clutch is set up, the clutch itself is not 75 foot-pounds. It's whatever foot-pounds after being a double reduction, the 2nd level reduction, and then there's 2 levels of gears behind the clutch. They put in probably 8 ounces of grease, just a real basic lithium grease, but they're obviously that this is a pretty heavy-duty tool. Is going to be working in, you know, many times pretty hot environments outside. And partially, you know, with the lower seal helps, but you can see that the bolt holes that mount this gearbox to the little frame are actually open. I assume that's why they just didn't want to do an oil filled, but that sure is a ton of grease. And all helical cut gears, as we can see, they're all at angles except for the clutch gear itself, and for some reason that's straight teeth, and I don't know why. Pretty decent little motor arbor on there, fairly coarse teeth. It looks like it's about an 8mm or 5/16 arbor there. So about this clutch, I mean, if it's slipping, then you just, even if the bearing is still on top, you can access this nut and try applying some more torque to it. But it does bottom out on a little shelf there. There's just a really thick, stout, like diesel valve spring. Just pressing on a couple of, I thought I saw a brawn. Nope, it's just a thick steel washers on either side of this gear, and this gear just spins on the shaft, and the washers, kind of like a circular saw blade in the way they mount on saws. They just rely on that spring tension. So if it ever slips too much on you, you can add shims, add another washer to push that spring down harder. But you have to be careful. This is the type of thing that's actually kind of a hassle to take apart. Like for me, I would use one of those bearing pullers that are the two halves that slide together, and you got to put a whole apparatus that you screw into them. But essentially, some type of a bearing puller that you can hook up onto this gear and pull on that washer so you don't have the spring tension against the nut. So this is something where you would, use some pieces of wood or really wrap heavily in cloth these lower gear teeth rather than the gear that might slip. Break the nut loose, and then you'd have to put it all in a gear puller so you could remove the nut and then slowly release the spring tension, and then be able to retension it after you add another washer. Cleaned up the clutch a little bit and was going to break the nut loose. It actually turns out that there is it really is a very stout spring. So much pressure that they don't Loctite the nut or anything. There's just so much spring tension that the nut doesn't want to get loose inherently. And since it's primarily forward operation, what they've set this up is this is a counter-threaded nut. So if you turn it this way to actually tighten it, and this way to loosen it, and it's not tightened all the way down. So they tighten it enough to give it about 75 foot-pounds. So I'm just going to tighten down that nut a little bit more. So that makes it really easy, because you can pull this out, and even if the bearing's on top, all you do is twist the nut backwards to tighten it up, and maybe give it a half turn or a full turn, and see if that tightens the clutch enough. By the way, the nut started off being about flush here. As you can see, I've tightened it down maybe 1/8 of an inch, maybe 3 millimeters or so. So that's significantly more pressure on there. Just for giggles to see how far it goes, there's a ton of thread. It started out flush, so you can basically run that nut down 10 millimeters. You can crank it down so much that you can almost get the spring coils to touch. It basically seems you can tighten this to the point where it just won't slip. But for a lot of people, this particular unit, this one's from Vevor, but whoever's making these, that's the easy way to deal with it slipping too much. Oh, and before I forget, so we have 5 screws that mount the motor to this plate, but they actually have it's a squishy, rubber mat that it is bolted through. I guess just allow a little bit of tiny amount of flex. But what that means is that these screws, it comes with an Allen wrench, but these screws down here are constantly going to be getting loose. It's something that you're always going to have to check on. These are going to use it, and it's going to wiggle and squish around, and then you're going to have to recheck these. And they actually put giant washers on them too. So I will say in summary here, that wasn't the hardest ground to dig. I couldn't go very deep because I know there's a lot of roots, and I couldn't really tear it up that much. But great for small planting and gardening and that type of stuff. I think one thing that people kind of get caught up on, almost literally and figuratively, is when they set this on the ground, one, you never push, because these have more than enough spiral and cork and weight, to drill the hole. But oftentimes they're not paying attention that the thin nature of these flutes and how aggressive an angle that they're at, that this thing just wants to screw itself into the ground, just like a big giant lag screw. So a lot of using these, particularly on softer ground or wetter soils, is you're actually kind of holding it up, preventing it from wanting to drill too fast. Also, when you get used to that technique of kind of actually holding it up, limiting how fast it can go into the ground, that when you hit rocks, roots, and that type of stuff, you're not going so hard and fast that the blade swings around and just hits it dead in the middle. It will kind of hit the top and skate off, and you'll be able to feel it without it just totally jamming and forcing itself against you. But that being said, it does have the clutch, even though on mine I customize it by wrenching that clutch way down. Mainly because, you know, I try to operate these in a more, I'll say, judicious fashion, where I have the handle against my body rather than actually just trying to totally stabilize it with my arms. Having a good footing and then kind of holding it up, but being aware if I do hit something that really causes it to have kickback, I will use my Tai Chi per se, and kind of roll with it, so that I guess I'm not running a big risk of blowing out the gears. But I like having it being able to deliver more power without the potential of the clutch slipping in just situations where you just have hard soil that is hard digging. I've seen enough YouTube videos. There's actually quite a few videos, since these have been around once again more than a decade, that some people are just running into issues where it just slips and they have to go real easy, where the machine could work a little bit harder, but they have to have that kind of safety margin, not one for the gearbox and two just for, not everybody's going to be operating in full Tai Chi mode. You know, proper stance, you know, ready to roll with it some and let off the trigger if it gets caught. That being said, the Vevor one is just fine. I spent a little more on the gas ones, and you know, you do get a more variety of bits, but you can certainly order them. They're actually not very expensive. Just remember that they're 20 millimeter shank on this, and you'll want to check that on whatever one that you may have. And Vevor does have gas ones, and I think the big advantage to an electric, a more modern one, is the fact that it's reversible, so you can back the auger out just in a more simple and straightforward fashion, rather than having to detach the power head from it and then try to wrench it out by hand. Which, you know, and these augers, they obviously get up to huge. They're big, you know, heavy equipment, excavator mounted augers. They're ones that fit on all the different sizes of tractors, and some of those don't have reverse. I was watching one video of some farmer who didn't have the ability to reverse the auger, and if it got jammed, then they were stuck detaching it from the tractor, turning the tractor around, trying to lift it with the bucket. So there's always some adventures when using these kind of tools, and it's super dependent on your ground conditions. Sometimes they only help out so much because you just have so many rocks or roots that you keep on hitting them, and you're just stuck, you know, trying to cut the roots and break apart or pry out the rocks. It's just about as fast to dig it by hand. But in some soils, man, these just save a huge amount of time, especially if you're building fences. And a last little tip is you can use one of those cheap Harbor Freight router speed controllers with it. It's just a brush AC motor. And so you can use a router speed controller and actually, if you do have rough ground, not run it at full blast. It's one of those little controllers that clips on your belt, and, you know, just turn it up for as much power as you need to make the hole go without having to experience full forces of the kickback. And these are actually a machine that would be actually kind of nice to have a variable speed on them. It would actually be pretty useful. Anyway, that's my review of this unit. I really appreciate you watching.